Captain Elias floated above the Planet 9, staring down at what was left of its once beautiful cities. The war had turned the world into a graveyard of twisted metal, shattered buildings, and blackened soil. Smoke still rose in thin, curling streams from the ruins, and the distant horizon glowed faintly red from fires that refused to die. The silence of the planet was heavy, almost suffocating, as if the air itself mourned the lives that had been lost. Elia's heart ached at the sight. He had seen many battlefields, but nothing like this. Nine had been more than just a colony. It had been home to an intelligent alien civilization, and now it was gone. As he maneuvered his small hovercraft down the cratered streets, Elias noticed the debris of what once had been a market. Broken stalls lay scattered like fallen soldiers, and small personal items, trinkets, toys, and scraps of clothing were strewn across the ground. It was easy to imagine the lives that had been here, and the weight of the silence made him almost stop breathing. Every corner seemed to hide a memory, and yet there was no one left to remember. The devastation was total. The enemy forces had not left a single intact structure, not a single sign of life. And yet, his sensors detected something strange. A small, irregular heat signature blinked faintly on his monitor. Elias froze, heart pounding. The signature was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was unmistakable. Someone or something was alive. He adjusted his trajectory and moved toward the signal with caution. The streets were littered with rubble, and each step required careful navigation to avoid falling debris. Every sound of his hovercraft's thrusters seemed too loud, like it was waking the ghosts of the city. Finally, he reached the source. Inside the hollow shell of a collapsed building, he saw her. She was tiny, no more than half the size of a human child, curled into a protective ball. Her skin glowed faintly with a violet hue, reflecting the flickering fires around her. Her hair was long and silver, scattered across her shoulders, and her large eyes, wide and luminous, stared up at him in a mixture of fear and curiosity. Dust coated her delicate frame, and her small body shook with exhaustion and trauma. For a long moment, neither spoke, not because she couldn't, but because words were meaningless here. The devastation spoke for itself. Elias slowly lowered himself to one knee, careful not to make sudden movements. "Hey," he said softly, his voice gentle but steady. "It's okay, you're safe now." He didn't know if she understood him, but he felt that words might still reach her in some way. He extended his hand, palm open, a gesture of peace. Her eyes widened further, and she tilted her head, studying him with cautious intelligence. She didn't move at first. Elias could feel the tension radiating from her, a fragile energy that balanced between fear and hope. He wanted to tell her that she didn't have to be alone anymore, that someone cared, but the words felt hollow in the shadow of the planet's ruin. Finally, she shifted slightly, enough for Elias to see her small chest rise and fall with each breath. It was so tiny, so fragile that he felt his own chest tighten. Without thinking, he slowly reached out and scooped her into his arms. She was light, almost weightless, like holding a handful of starlight. Her warmth contrasted sharply with the cold ash that coated the ruins, and for the first time in hours or maybe days, there was life in this place. He cradled her gently, speaking again softly, as though the sound of his voice could protect her. "You're going to be okay. I won't let anything happen to you." As he lifted her and carried her toward his ship, Elias noticed how carefully she clung to him, as if sensing a bond forming. He could feel her heartbeat, fast and irregular, trembling like a bird caught in a storm. He didn't know who she was or what she had lost, but he knew he couldn't leave her behind. In her eyes, he saw a spark of resilience, a flicker of life that had survived against impossible odds. And in that spark, Elias felt something stir within himself, a feeling he hadn't allowed in a long time: hope. The journey back to his ship was long, each step through the broken streets reminding him of the world that had been destroyed. Yet with her in his arms, the ruin seemed slightly less empty. It was as if carrying her had given the planet a fragment of its lost soul. Elias whispered stories to her as he walked, stories of distant stars, peaceful planets, and times when the universe was not so cruel. He didn't know if she understood his language, but the sound of his voice seemed to calm her. her small fingers wrapped around his suit, her eyes closing briefly in trust. In that moment, Elias realized something extraordinary. This tiny alien girl, lost and alone in the wreckage of her home, had already begun to change him. And perhaps, unknowingly, she would change the war itself. Elias carried Lyra into the dimly lit interior of his ship. The hum of engines and the gentle vibration of the floor were foreign to her, yet somehow comforting. She stayed still in his arms, her large violet eyes taking in every detail: the metallic walls, the blinking lights, the faint smell of oil and machinery. Elias gently set her down on a cushioned bench, careful not to startle her. She flinched slightly at the motion, wrapping her tiny hands around her knees, but she didn't run. He crouched in front of her, keeping his voice soft. "My name is Elias. What's yours?" He paused, realizing she didn't answer, only tilted her head and stared. He smiled faintly. That was fine. Names could come later. For now, she needed safety, warmth, and trust. He pulled a small blanket from a nearby storage compartment and draped it over her shoulders. The warmth seemed to relax her slightly, and she leaned into it, her shivering slowing. Elias spent the next hours observing her carefully. Lyra was cautious, almost ghost-like, moving only when necessary, but there was intelligence in the way she watched him. Her fingers traced patterns on the bench, delicate and precise, as though she were analyzing every detail. Her eyes occasionally flicked toward the ship's control panels, her gaze lingering in ways that suggested curiosity far beyond a child. Elias felt a mixture of awe and concern. This wasn't just an ordinary child. She was something extraordinary, fragile yet remarkably aware. Over the next few days, Elias tried to communicate. Words failed at first. He used gestures, pointing at objects and repeating their names, showing her how to pick up a cup, how to use how to move carefully in the tight corridors of the ship. At first, she only watched, her head tilting and her eyes wide as if trying to memorize every movement. Slowly, tentatively, she began to mimic him. Her first attempts were clumsy, but her concentration was intense, and each small success brought a quiet sparkle of pride to her violet eyes. Elias started calling her Lyra, after the constellation that had guided him through countless missions. The name felt right, soft and light, carrying with it a sense of hope. Lyra didn't speak it back at first, but she responded in her own way, a small nod, a hesitant smile, a brush of her hand against his. Each gesture was a tiny bridge, connecting two beings from entirely different worlds. Elias realized that trust was not instant. It was earned slowly, through patience, consistency, and kindness. But trust was not all they shared. Lyra had abilities that startled him. One night, as Elias was running diagnostics on the ship's systems, the lights flickered and a panel began to spark. Lyra reached out instinctively, her small hand hovering over the wires. A soft glow emanated from her skin and the sparking stopped instantly. Elias stared, mouth open. You just fixed it," he said, disbelief in his voice. Lyra tilted her head, almost shyly, as if this was nothing special. Elias felt a mixture of wonder and unease. Her abilities were a gift, but he didn't fully understand them yet. Despite the trauma she had endured, Lyra began to show other signs of personality. She would hum softly while exploring, a melodic sound that reminded Elias of the wind chimes from his childhood home. She was fascinated by simple things: the way light reflected on metal surfaces, the hum of the engines, the flicker of the ship's display panels. Occasionally, she would curl up next to him, resting her head on his shoulder, and he could feel her breathing slow as she slept. In those moments, the galaxy's vast dangers felt distant, and for the first time in months, Elias allowed himself to believe in small moments of peace. One evening, as the ship glided silently through a nebula, Elias caught Lyra staring at the stars outside the viewport. He sat beside her, careful not to disturb her, and followed her gaze. "You like them?" he asked softly. Lyra nodded slowly, her eyes reflecting the sparkling expanse of space. Elias realized that despite everything she had lost, despite the destruction of her home world, she still carried wonder within her. That wonder was fragile, but it was alive, and in it, he saw a spark that could never be destroyed by war. By now, the bond between them was undeniable. Elias was her protector, her teacher, and her companion, while she was his reminder of the beauty and innocence that still existed in a universe torn apart by conflict. Each day, each quiet moment, strengthened the invisible thread connecting them. He spoke to her of hope, of survival, and of the stars, and she responded in ways that transcended words, through trust, laughter, and small gestures that slowly filled the emptiness in both of their hearts. In that fragile, quiet connection, Elias realized something he hadn't admitted even to himself. He was no longer just carrying Lyra to safety. She was carrying him, too, lifting the weight of loss, despair, and fatigue from his shoulders. In the bond between them, a new kind of strength was born, a promise that even in the darkest of places, life could endure. And as he looked at her small, luminous form, nestled safely against the blanket, Elias understood that their connection was not just the beginning of a friendship. It was the first light in a war that had long seemed hopeless. Days turned into weeks aboard Elias' ship. The galaxy outside remained dark and unwelcoming, filled with the echoes of war. Yet inside, a small bubble of life had formed. Lyra, once frightened and fragile, began to show subtle signs of curiosity and courage. She would explore the narrow corridors slowly, touching the walls, examining buttons, and listening to the hum of the engines. Elias watched her with a mix of pride and caution, aware that every new step she took into the unknown could also be dangerous. At first, Lyra had avoided human contact, flinching even at the gentlest touch. But now, she moved closer to Elias without fear, often sitting near him during meal times or quietly observing him work on the ship's systems. When she looked at him, there was a spark in her violet eyes, as if she were trying to understand the world through his experiences. Elias realized that trust was more than just keeping her alive. It was about letting her feel safe, letting her make small choices, and accepting that she had a mind of her own. One morning, while Elias was adjusting the ship's navigation systems, Lyra came up beside him. She placed her tiny hand on a panel, her fingers glowing faintly as she traced patterns across the controls. The system, which had been sluggish and unresponsive, hummed to life, running perfectly again. Elias stared at her in disbelief. You did it again," he said, his voice a mixture of astonishment and awe. Lyra only looked at him shyly, as if unsure whether she had done something impressive. For Elias, this was no small miracle. Her abilities were extraordinary, and the way she wielded them without effort reminded him of the hidden potential that sometimes emerges from the most fragile beings. Their bond deepened with every shared moment. Elias began to teach Lyra small games, simple ways to interact with him and the ship, and basic human gestures like smiling or laughing. At first, she mimicked them hesitantly, tilting her head and blinking slowly, as if she were testing a new sensation. But with time, her attempts became more confident. She laughed softly when Elias made a silly face, and he felt a warmth spread through his chest, the kind of warmth he had not felt in years. In those moments, the war and its horrors faded into the background, leaving only the fragile beauty of life and trust. But trust was not built in comfort alone. One afternoon, a sudden turbulence shook the ship violently. Alarms blared and warning lights flashed in red. Lyra froze, her small body pressed against the wall, eyes wide with fear. Elias moved immediately to shield her, placing his hands on her shoulders. "It's okay, Lyra. I've got you," he said, his voice firm and steady. He guided her to a safe corner, holding her as the ship rocked unpredictably through the remnants of a nearby asteroid field. She pressed her forehead against his chest, her heartbeat quick and uneven. And in that heartbeat, Elias felt a connection deeper than words, a silent communication of fear, courage, and reliance that transcended language and species. After the turbulence passed, Lyra stayed closer to him than before. It was as if the ordeal had reinforced the fragile trust between them. She began to reach out on her own, brushing his arm or touching the consoles he worked on, sharing in the small victories of the day. Elias realized that she was not only learning from him, but also teaching him, showing him patience, empathy, and the quiet resilience of those who had survived unimaginable loss. Elias also began to notice subtler signs of her intelligence and awareness. She could anticipate the ship's minor system errors before they happened and often positioned herself in ways that seemed protective, as if she understood danger instinctively. One evening, while he worked late in the control room, she stood silently behind him, her glowing hands hovering near the console. Without warning, a power surge sparked in the system. Lyra's glow intensified, and the surge stopped instantly. Elias looked at her in awe, realizing that she had an innate connection to technology that was both incredible and slightly terrifying. Yet despite her abilities, Lyra remained vulnerable in ways that reminded Elias of her youth. She would occasionally curl up alone, hugging herself tightly when memories of her destroyed home seemed to haunt her. In those moments, he would sit quietly beside her, never rushing, never forcing words, just offering a presence that was unwavering. Slowly, she began to lean into him, resting her head on his shoulder, allowing herself to be comforted without fear. Elias felt a profound sense of purpose in those moments. He was not only protecting her from the dangers of the galaxy, but also from the shadows of her own memories. By the end of the week, the unspoken bond between them had grown into something undeniable. Elias was no longer just a protector. He had become a friend, a guide, and a guardian. Lyra, in turn, had begun to see him as a constant in a universe that had been chaotic and cruel. Their trust was fragile, yes, but it was strong enough to endure small crises, to survive turbulence, and to grow in the quiet moments between chaos. In that trust, Elias realized something that he had long forgotten, that even amidst war and destruction, life could be extraordinary, and the bonds we form could be the most powerful force in the universe. The ship moved silently through the cold emptiness of space, stars streaking past in long, shimmering lines. Elias had grown used to the quiet hum of the engines and the soft glow of the control panels. Lyra sat nearby, her violet eyes reflecting the endless cosmos outside. For a moment, everything felt calm, almost peaceful, as if the universe had forgotten the war that raged beyond their small vessel. Elias allowed himself to relax, glancing at her and smiling. She returned the gesture with a small, tentative smile, and he felt a warmth in his chest he had not known for years. But then something changed. Lyra's body stiffened suddenly, and her gaze snapped to the front viewport, wide and alert. Elias followed her eyes, expecting perhaps a shift in the stars, a comet, or a distant planet, but nothing unusual appeared. He frowned. "Lyra, what is it?" he asked softly, stepping closer. She didn't answer. Her hands glowed faintly, pulsing in a rhythmic pattern, and her breathing quickened. Elias felt a sudden chill run down his spine. This was not her usual curiosity or playfulness. This was warning. Elias moved to the control panel, scanning for any signs of danger. His instruments showed nothing at first. No ships, no debris, no radiation spikes. But Lyra's instincts were sharper than any sensor. Her glow intensified, and she pressed her tiny hands against the console, her eyes locked on something only she could perceive. Elias felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He had been trained for countless battles, yet he realized that sometimes technology alone could not detect the threats that lurked in the shadows. Minutes passed, tense and silent, broken only by the hum of the engines and Lyra's soft, steady pulse of light. Then the sensors finally registered the faintest anomaly, a distant fleet, warships moving with quiet precision, closing in on nearby colonies. Elia's heart sank. He had hoped the sector would remain untouched, that some corners of the galaxy had been spared the enemy's wrath. But Lyra had known before the sensors, before the warnings. Her instincts had always been a step ahead. He crouched beside her, his voice steady but urgent. "We need to prepare, Lyra. Can you help me?" She nodded, and for the first time Elias felt the full weight of their partnership. It was no longer just about keeping her safe. Now she was guiding him, and he trusted her completely. Together, they moved through the ship, securing systems, checking navigation controls, and preparing defensive measures. Lyra's hands glowed intermittently, interacting with the ship's systems in ways that Elias could not fully understand, stabilizing engines and boosting shields with ease. As the enemy fleet drew closer, Elias realized something extraordinary. They were no longer alone in their actions. Lyra's presence transformed the way he thought, made him faster, sharper, and more aware. He watched her tiny form work tirelessly beside him, and his chest swelled with pride and awe. Despite her youth, despite her size, she was not a mere passenger. She was a partner, a guide, a force of her own. The bond they had nurtured over weeks had now become a tool, something that could change the outcome of a battle. But there was fear too. Elias could feel it in the tightening of his stomach, the way his hands trembled slightly as he typed commands and monitored the enemy's approach. He thought of the colonies that would be lost if they failed, of the lives that depended on their decisions. And then he glanced at Lyra. Her small frame shone with determination, and though she did not speak, her courage radiated as strongly as any soldier's. In that instant, Elias understood something vital. Bravery was not measured in size or experience or even species. Sometimes it came from the smallest heart with the fiercest will to survive. Hours passed in preparation, each minute stretching longer than the last. The enemy fleet grew nearer, a dark shadow against the light of distant stars. Elias worked tirelessly, guided by Lyra's insights, following her subtle gestures and glowing signals. Together, they coordinated the ship systems, anticipating maneuvers, adjusting shields, and preparing weapons. Elias marveled at her instincts, the way she predicted movements and patterns, the way her glow pulsed in rhythm with the ship's needs. He had fought alongside thousands of soldiers before, but none had read the battlefield like this alien girl beside him. Finally, Elias took a moment to breathe, placing a hand gently on her small shoulder. "We're ready," he whispered. Lyra looked up at him, her violet eyes glowing softly, full of trust and courage. Elias felt a surge of emotion, a mixture of hope and determination. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The galaxy could throw all its dangers at them, but in that quiet, fleeting moment, he knew one truth: they were stronger together. And sometimes the smallest light could guide the way through the darkest night. The first flashes of light appeared on the horizon, distant yet ominous. Elias gripped the control panel tightly, his knuckles white under the dim glow of the cockpit. The enemy fleet had arrived. Warships, sleek and dark, cut through the void like predators, aiming to destroy everything in their path. Lyra stood beside him, small but steady, her violet glow brightening as she focused. Her eyes tracked the fleet's movement with uncanny precision, each pulse of her hands guiding the ship's systems. Elias had never seen anything like it. She wasn't just helping, she was leading. The first wave struck without warning. Explosions rippled through space as plasma beams tore through shields. Elias felt the ship shudder violently. He shouted orders, but it was Lyra's instincts that truly saved them. "To the left, now," she urged silently with her glowing hands, and the ship responded, shifting just in time to avoid a direct hit. Elias followed her guidance, maneuvering the vessel with a precision that surprised even him. Each successful dodge bolstered his confidence, and he realized that the alien girl in front of him was not just a survivor. She was a weapon, a beacon, and a strategist all at once. Despite the chaos, Elias noticed something remarkable. Lyra didn't panic. Her fear was present, yes, but it was tempered by clarity, a focus born from instincts he could not comprehend. She pointed to a cluster of smaller enemy drones that had begun to flank them. Without hesitation, Elias fired the ship's automated turrets, guided by her subtle gestures. The drones exploded in a chain of sparks and fire, and Elias felt a thrill of triumph he had not experienced in years. They were surviving against impossible odds together. Hours passed in a blur of attacks, dodges, and evasive maneuvers. Each time the enemy tried to anticipate their movement, Lyra's instincts seemed to counter it perfectly. She guided Elias to weak points in the enemy formation, directing him toward gaps that the human fleet would have otherwise missed. Every pulse of her glowing hands, every tilt of her head, became a language of strategy. Elias realized with awe and disbelief that this tiny alien girl was rewriting the battle as it happened. Their partnership was seamless, a perfect union of human skill and alien intuition. But the battle was far from easy. A massive warship broke through the front lines, its energy cannon charging a devastating blast. Elias calculated quickly. Shields wouldn't hold if it fired. Panic flared for a moment, but Lyra reacted instantly. Her hands glowed fiercely, her light spreading through the ship's systems in a way Elias could feel in his bones. The cannon misfired, its energy deflected by the interference she created. Elias barely had time to comprehend what happened before Lyra's glow dimmed slightly, as if she had used a part of herself to protect them. He realized she had risked herself in ways he had not understood before, risked her very life to save him and the ship. The moment passed, but the emotional weight lingered. Elias looked at her, his voice catching slightly. "You're incredible," he said. Lyra blinked, her glow softening, and for a brief instant she allowed herself a small smile. In that smile, Elias felt a surge of pride, gratitude, and a fierce protective instinct. He wasn't just fighting for survival anymore, he was fighting for her. As the battle continued, Elias noticed the enemy faltering. Their tactics were precise, but they could not anticipate the combination of human skill and Lyra's alien intuition. They had become unpredictable, a force neither side had ever faced. One by one, enemy ships began to retreat, unable to cope with the agility, foresight, and synergy of the pair. In the heat of chaos, Elias realized that it was not firepower alone that had turned the tide. It was trust, instinct, and the bond between him and Lyra. Finally, the last of the enemy ships disappeared into the void, leaving behind the quiet hum of victory. The ship was battered, but it had survived. Elias sank into his seat, exhausted, and Lyra curled up beside him, her small body trembling from fatigue. He placed a hand on her head, feeling her pulse against his. In the aftermath, the reality struck him with full force. They had not only survived, they had changed the course of the battle. Together, they had proven that courage, trust, and unity could overcome even the most overwhelming odds. For a long while they sat in silence, letting the adrenaline fade, letting the stars outside become a calm backdrop to their exhausted bodies. Elias looked down at Lyra, her violet eyes meeting his, and he knew that their bond had grown stronger than ever. It was no longer just a bond of survival. It was a bond of partnership, of respect, of something deeper that could shape the future. The galaxy had tested them, and together they had emerged victorious. But both knew, without words, that this was only the beginning. The battle was over, but the silence that followed was heavy and almost unbearable. The ship floated through the calm expanse of space, its hull battered and scorched from the recent fight. Elias leaned back in his chair, exhausted, his body aching from hours of tension and adrenaline. The stars outside the viewport seemed peaceful, indifferent to the destruction they had just witnessed. For a moment, he allowed himself to think the worst was behind them. But when he glanced at Lyra, curled up on the bench, he felt a fresh surge of worry. Her small body shivered slightly, exhaustion evident in every movement. Elias approached her slowly, kneeling down beside the blanket that wrapped her like a cocoon. "Hey," he whispered gently, brushing a stray strand of silver hair from her glowing face. She looked up at him with wide, violet eyes, tired but alert. He noticed faint burns on her hands from overexertion, and he realized that during the battle, she had poured more of herself into the ship than he had ever imagined. Her body may have been small, but the cost of the victory had been real. Suddenly, alarms blared faintly, a minor breach in the hull. Elias reacted immediately, rushing to the control panel, but Lyra's hands glowed as she moved toward the failing system. The glow pulsed brighter than ever before, and the alarm stopped. Elias stared at her in disbelief. "You saved us again," he said, voice tight with emotion. Lyra's tiny form wavered, and he saw the toll it had taken. She wasn't just guiding the ship, she was sacrificing her own strength to protect them. His heart clenched at the realization. Her life was intertwined with the ship, with his, in a way that demanded both awe and fear. Elias gently lifted her into his arms, cradling her as he had when he first found her on 9. "You're going to rest now," he whispered. She pressed her head against his chest, her breathing shallow but steady. For the first time, Elias allowed himself to imagine the pain she must carry, the trauma of her destroyed world, the fear of being alone, the burden of her abilities. And yet she had faced all of it with courage that the stars themselves. He felt tears prick the corners of his eyes, but he blinked them back. There was no time for weakness, not yet. She needed him to be strong, just as he needed her to be alive. Hours passed in quiet care. Elias kept watch while Lyra rested, her small hands occasionally brushing against his chest, a silent connection that reminded him of what they had fought for. He thought of the colonies they had saved, the lives that had been spared by her instinct, by her courage, by their bond. He realized that their victory had come at a cost that went beyond metal and fire. It was her youth, her strength, her very essence that had carried them through. And yet she remained radiant, even fragile, like a star fighting against the darkness. Later, as the ship's system stabilized, Elias allowed himself a brief moment to speak. "Lyra," he said softly, kneeling beside her again, "you're more than just my partner. You're extraordinary, and you saved more lives than I can count." She looked at him, her glowing eyes reflecting the starlight outside. She did not answer in words, but her small smile said everything he needed to know. She trusted him as completely as he trusted her. And in that trust, Elias found a strength he hadn't known he possessed. But peace was fragile. Elias knew the war was far from over, that enemies still lurked in the shadows of space. Lyra had given everything she could, and yet he could not promise her safety. That thought gnawed at him relentlessly. He pressed a gentle kiss to the top of her head, whispering, "I'll protect you no matter what comes next." Lyra's hand twitched in response, almost as if she understood, and her glow pulsed softly, a quiet reassurance in the darkness. As they drifted together, Elias reflected on the journey they had shared. From the ruins of Nine to the heart of battle, they had survived against impossible odds. Yet survival had never been enough. They had fought not just for themselves, but for trust, for hope, for the fragile spark of life that refused to be extinguished. Elias realized that Lyra had changed him as much as he had protected her. She had reminded him that courage comes in all forms, that strength is measured not only in firepower, but in loyalty, love, and the willingness to risk everything for another. The quiet stretched on, filled with unspoken words and shared breaths. Elias held her close, feeling the steady rhythm of her pulse against his chest. In that small, fragile body, he sensed the weight of galaxies and destinies intertwined. And as he looked out at the stars beyond the viewport, he understood something profound. The cost of their bond had been high, but it had forged something far more powerful than fear or war. It had forged hope. And sometimes hope, fragile and luminous, was the greatest weapon of all. Months had passed since the battle that had tested them both. The war had ended, but its scars were everywhere: burned planets, shattered fleets, and lost lives lingering like ghosts among the stars. Yet aboard Elia's ship, there was a small bubble of hope, a fragile light that had survived the chaos. Lyra had grown stronger, both in spirit and in her abilities. She moved confidently through the ship, no longer the frightened, trembling girl Elias had first found on Nine. The bond they had forged in the fires of war had become unbreakable, a connection deeper than words, deeper than time. Elias watched her from the command deck as she studied the stars outside the viewport. The galaxy stretched endlessly before them, vast and unknown, but Lyra's gaze was steady, filled with wonder rather than fear. He marveled at how much she had grown, how her once fragile presence now radiated quiet strength. She turned to him and gave a small smile, the kind of smile that carried gratitude, trust, and a promise. Elias felt his heart swell. They had survived, they had fought, and somehow together they had found a reason to keep going. The universe had been cruel, but humans and aliens alike had begun rebuilding what had been destroyed. New settlements were forming, and communication networks had been restored in the sectors they had protected. Reports from other survivors arrived frequently, describing renewed hope and collaboration. Elias realized that their actions, guided by Lyra's instincts, their teamwork, and their courage, had saved more than lives. They had saved the possibility of peace, the chance for the galaxy to heal. And for that he felt a quiet, profound pride. One day, as they approached a newly rebuilt colony, Lyra hesitated at the airlock. She looked at Elias, her small hand brushing the panel as if testing her courage. "You ready?" he asked softly. She nodded, her violet eyes shining. Together, they stepped into the colony, their presence immediately noticed by the humans and aliens working side by side. There was curiosity in their eyes, wonder at the small alien girl and the human soldier who had survived against impossible odds. Yet there was also respect, the kind born from seeing courage firsthand. Children ran toward Lyra, laughing as she extended her glowing hands to them in play. Their joy was contagious, filling the empty spaces that the war had carved in hearts and minds. Elias watched quietly, his chest heavy with emotion. This was why they had fought. This was why survival mattered, not just for themselves, but for the countless others who could now experience life, friendship, and hope. Lyra had changed the war, but she had also changed the hearts of those who had witnessed her courage. That evening, Elias and Lyra stood together on a balcony overlooking the colony. The twin suns of the system were setting, casting golden light across the landscape, warming the metal and stone of the newly rebuilt structures. Lyra rested her head lightly on his shoulder, her glow faint but steady. Elias felt a sense of peace he had thought impossible to feel again. He placed a hand gently over hers. "We did it, Lyra," he whispered. "We made a difference." She lifted her eyes to him, and though she didn't speak, her expression said it all. Yes, they had. Together. For the first time, Elias allowed himself to imagine a future beyond war, a future where Lyra could grow safely, where the galaxy could recover from its wounds, and where their bond could remain unbroken. They had endured the ruins, survived battles that seemed unwinnable, and faced dangers that would have shattered ordinary beings. Yet through it all, their trust, courage, and connection had prevailed. It was proof that even in the darkest times, hope could shine, and even the smallest light could guide countless others. As night fell, the stars appeared, brighter than ever above the colony. Lyra pointed to one of them, her small finger tracing a line across the sky. "That's home," Elias asked softly. She nodded, her eyes reflecting both the light of the stars and the memory of the world they had lost. Elias smiled, understanding that home was not just a place. It was a feeling, a bond, and a shared journey. For him, home was now wherever she was, and for her it was the same. The galaxy had been shattered, but together, Elias and Lyra had survived its chaos. Together, they had inspired courage, hope, and a vision for a better future. And though the war had left scars that could never fully heal, they had discovered something stronger than fear or loss. A connection that could not be broken, a light that could not be extinguished. The stars above bore witness to their triumph, and in that quiet, beautiful moment, Elias knew one truth clearly. Sometimes, the smallest bonds could change the course of entire worlds. They stood side by side, gazing at the horizon, the twin suns setting and the stars rising. The galaxy was vast, uncertain, and still dangerous. But as long as they faced it together, Elias knew they could endure anything. Lyra squeezed his hand gently, her glowing warmth filling him with unspoken reassurance. He returned the gesture, a promise echoing silently between them. Whatever came next, they would face it as one. And for the first time in a long time, the future felt bright.